As summer came, that 1863, the fighting at Vicksburg, the siege, became mired in this stagnation. It became a matter of waiting. In the meanwhile, on the Rappahannock, where Fredericksburg stood, there was a kind of eerie lull in the fighting. As June approached, Congress broke for the summer, and families of politicians, including those in Lincoln's cabinet, went home for the summer. Um, in that quiet period, sons serving in the Army of the Potomac came home on leave. Some went home to Maryland and Pennsylvania. In the meantime, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, is putting pressure on Robert E. Lee to relieve Vicksburg, to deploy some of his troops from the Army of Northern Tennessee dug in at Fredericksburg to be sent to break the siege that Ulysses S. Grant has mounted around Vicksburg. Instead, Robert E. Lee proposes a different scenario. Robert E. Lee now asks the Confederate government to allow him to force Ulysses S. Grant to take off troops that are online on Vicksburg rather than the Confederacy removing troops at Fredericksburg. In other words, let's put pressure on the Union somewhere else to relieve the pressure at Vicksburg. And that, of course, is going to lead to this invasion of not only Maryland, but right into Pennsylvania that Robert E. Lee is going to now undertake in June and July of 1863. The plan that Robert E. Lee has is to drive north towards the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, and from there strike out to Baltimore and Philadelphia, cutting entirely the north away from Washington, D.C., south of it. It again is similar to what he attempted to do the previous year that ended up in the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg, but his plans now are much more extensive, including, as I say, to drive all the way into Philadelphia, of course, a major American city and the cradle of the American Revolution from 1776. This would, of course, this kind of movement, if successful, would force the Union government out of Washington. Washington would eventually, if this went through, fall under the Confederacy. And this is going to be the furthest any kind of major Confederate movement in this Civil War going northwards, although we'll see there'll be raids coming in from Confederate troops infiltrated into Canada on the Quebec-Vermont border, but those are smaller raids. In terms of battle, this will be the largest movement northwards, the largest counterattack that the Confederacy is going to carry out against the Union. That month, as the Confederates are moving north, of course, without satellites or any kind of extensive aerial surveillance other than hot air balloons, no one is quite sure where the Confederate army is moving. And so the Union army is essentially flanking the Confederate movement northwards on their flank and behind them. And the Confederates will reach into the outskirts of Harrisburg, north of Gettysburg, again, the capital of Pennsylvania. And that's where this momentous battle is going to take place. It's the largest and most bloody single battle in the Western Hemisphere ever. Between July 1st and July 3rd, 1863, 165,000 men would clash at this point in the city of Gettysburg. There are 93,000 Union troops versus 72,000 Confederate troops. And there will be some, over the 3 days, 46,000 total casualties. And ironically, as you can see from this map, because the Confederacy had penetrated all the way up to the Susquehanna River, separating Harrisburg on the other bank, ironically, the Confederates are going to be in the Battle of Maryland attacking from the north, while the Union is attacking from the south. The city of Gettysburg is about a maybe 6-hour drive from Toronto, depending on how fast you drive. It's a fairly quick drive down to Buffalo and then south until you hit Pennsylvania, and that'll take you to Gettysburg. The city itself, or the town, is significant in that it incorporates all these crossroads, as you can see from a modern map, and railways as well kind of intersect in Gettysburg in this kind of hub-like structure. The town has a mix of terrain. You can see we're looking southwards through Gettysburg. You can see that there's a kind of hilly terrain south of Gettysburg, and then there are just before the town these flat fields as well. So the battle is a complex one, sometimes fought in this kind of bushy, hilly, rocky terrain. Other times it's fought on a kind of open fields, and you know, there's a reason I discourage people from trying to write a 10-page essay on the history of the Battle of Gettysburg, because it's multiple battles that sub-battles that have their own names. You know, the battle for Round Top, the battle in Devil's Glen, the battle in the wheat field, the cornfield, and so forth. So there are all these different battles that take place over the 3 days that in their totality will make up the Battle of Gettysburg, which will kind of culminate with this dramatic charge by the Confederacy that again I'll describe to you. You can see here on the first day, the Confederates will drive at Gettysburg from the north. And here is a fairly accurate illustration of just the totality of the size of this battle. As I say, it's of Napoleonic scale. The first day, the Confederates now attack Union lines from the north. There's all sorts of stories at exactly why the Confederacy turns back. to attack their pursuers, the Union. Partly it could be because precisely that, the Union is pursuing the Confederate Army and they want to ensure that their rear flank is safe. There are other stories that the Confederates believe that there is a supply of shoes inside of Gettysburg, a warehouse with shoes. And certainly you can see from the statistics we look at how just industrially underdeveloped the Confederates are. Some Confederate troops are actually fighting barefoot. And there are these reminiscences from people in Pennsylvania who, look out their window in the morning and suddenly see the Confederate Army marching by their home. They are shocked by just how raggedy and shoeless the Confederate army is. So this kind of allegation that was about getting shoes for the army is not a far-fetched one. As far as we know, there aren't any kind of major depredations committed by the Confederate Army on their march through Pennsylvania and through Maryland. Now, Maryland was, as I say, very pro-secession, and the secessionists in Maryland were essentially put down by Lincoln when he suspended habeas corpus and started arresting everyone, including the police chief and mayor of Baltimore and forth. But Pennsylvania was resoundingly not only Unionist, but as well, because of a strong Quaker presence in Pennsylvania, there's a strong anti-slavery abolitionist movement there as well. Yet, despite this, again, the Confederates do not perpetrate the kind of depredations that Sherman will later in Georgia and South Carolina and the South in his Sherman's March, or March to the Sea, or March to Savannah, as it will become known. In any regards, here you can see the first day, July 1st, 1863, the Confederates now attack Union lines at Gettysburg, and they force the Union out of Gettysburg. And here you can see all the different battle points: the Wheat Field, Little Round Top, Devil's Den, Wolf's Hill, Spengler's Spring, and Culp's Hill. All of these will be, as I say, individual battles. On the second day, the Union now is falling back. And you can see how, following the battles at the Peach Orchard and in Rosewoods and the Wheat Field, the Union ends up taking this position at a cemetery known as Cemetery Ridge. In fact, a ridge that runs along that cemetery. And that today, Cemetery Ridge is where the National Battlefield Park is located, and it's filled with hundreds and hundreds of monuments. It's certainly probably the largest military national battlefield parks in the United States. Because so many units had fought there, almost every unit would put a monument there. So it's an amazing place that you can actually drive through it past this kind of labyrinth of monuments from the Battle of Gettysburg. When the battle begins, July 1st, one observer at that time writes, quote, the turning point of the whole war seems to be crowding itself into the present. It seems almost impossible to wait for the result. Hours become days, and days become months in such a suspense. Lincoln and his cabinet now just hang on to desperately for every new telegram, and the telegrams are spotty at best. Even as telegrams come in that report Union advances at Gettysburg, they're not entirely believed. Reverses had occurred before when good news had suddenly turned bad, and everyone, including the northern press, remains cautious as to what is going to happen. Journalists, of course, are telegraphing back news. Lincoln, at this point, actually moves his cabinet office into the post office because there's no direct telegraph line yet running to the White House. And so Lincoln, in order to get the news immediately rather than have someone ride over, with a dispatch from the post office, is actually there to immediately respond to anything that might be happening at Gettysburg. July 2nd, the Union, as I say, is on the defensive. They've been driven out of Gettysburg by this fierce Confederate attack on July 1st. And the next day, of course, everyone is awaiting for this battle to be resolved in one way or the other. If Robert E. Lee can successfully drive General Meade, who's in charge of the Union, out of Gettysburg, then, of course, and hold Gettysburg, this, of course, gives him a kind of base now from which to continue pressing across the river into Harrisburg and then on to Baltimore and on to Philadelphia. So everyone is very anxious for what is going to occur on July 3rd. July 3rd, now the Confederacy is going to make a desperate attack on the remaining Union lines holding just south of Gettysburg in the hope of breaking them. And you can see a little dot there, green dot, where Pickett makes his charge, General Pickett. This is kind of the turning point moment in the battle, and some kind of, I think, traditionally, this becomes a turning point in the war itself. General Pickett is ordered now by Robert E. Lee to take his division and break the Union lines at holding at Cemetery Ridge. Here's General Pickett. Pickett is also a West Point classmate of Thomas Stonewall Jackson and George McClellan. And in fact, George Pickett in that class of 1846 is the GOAT, the one who ranked lowest at West Point in the 46 year. He is not necessarily a incompetent or bad general. He is an earnest general with a good reputation, and no one will blame him certainly for what's going to happen in his charge. Nonetheless, Robert E. Lee gives him the order to charge a line of Union troops and artillery dug in on Cemetery Ridge around this small bunch or copse of trees. This is the view that Pickett has towards the ridge, and you can see on the horizon there's this kind of opening and a few trees there. That's what's known as the Angle Copse. And Pickett now, from this position, and this is, of course, this is obviously a contemporary photograph, but the terrain has been kept pristine and the same to this day, the way it was back then. So this is really what Pickett and his men would have seen. And lined up on that ridge there are artillery and Union troops. And now Pickett has to make this what he knows is a suicidal charge, and not certainly the first one that is made in this war. And so Pickett is going to now, under fire, cross this field toward that copse of trees right there. And there you can see all the monuments there that I talked about stretched out over the ridge and behind it. The Confederates arrive within this line here where the stone wall is, before the attack is stopped by Union defenders along this line here. And again, there in the back, you can see kind of the hilly terrain. And again, the monuments. The Angle Copse itself is surrounded by this iron fence protecting the tree growth there. The division that Pickett leads in what becomes known as Pickett's Charge, of course, is almost entirely wiped out. And they do come within this range as depicted here. We're talking of approximately within 10 yards of each other, and at some point actually making physical contact with each other. This attack, Pickett's Charge, and the Angle Copse will be nicknamed as the high tide mark of the Confederacy. This is as far as the Confederacy got in terms of its attack or counterattack against the Union, and perhaps in the war against its war against the Union for the rebel cause of secession and an attempt to keep their slaves. Certainly the war, as I've often suggested, was not about the abolition of slavery, but for the Confederates, in a way, it was about keeping their slaves. So we can certainly look at it, if we look at the war and slavery in that point of view, certainly for the Confederates, it's about holding their slaves. When General Pickett returns from that charge, which he survives and parts of his division survives, at one point, Robert E. Lee will ask him, General, where is your division? And Pickett will respond, I have no division, sir. It was destroyed. And Pickett will be bitter for the rest of his life, having been ordered by Robert E. Lee to lead this suicidal charge, which Robert E. Lee knew was suicidal, but it was the last desperate attempt to as I say, take the field at Gettysburg. On the evening of July 3rd, the New York Times, which has been reporting on the progress of this battle day by day, as telegraphs is stories are being wired to New York from the area. On July 3rd, the New York Times, as late as 9 p.m., still reports that, quote, no reliable advices had been received here from the Pennsylvania battlefield. It is generally felt that this is the crisis of the war. Intense anxiety prevails, end of quote. Indeed, everyone is very much aware of just how important the Battle of Gettysburg is at the moment that is being fought. Often, people are not aware in a contemporary moment as a battle is being fought, what kind of significance it may or may not have to the overall conduct of the war. And this is not the case for Gettysburg. When it happens, everybody is aware what it means. It's only at dawn on the morning of July 4th, big holiday, Independence Day in the United States, that General Meade now confirms by telegram that the Confederates have now fallen back from Gettysburg. It's a Union victory. And once again, Meade, the Union, will fail to destroy Robert E. Lee's army. Once again, Robert E. Lee manages to escape destruction on the battlefield with, minus his casualties, but with the rest of his army intact, and make his way all the way back to Fredericksburg, where they once again dig in. But for the moment, this is a resounding victory, and Lincoln issues this celebratory press release. And there's a sense of relief and exhilaration, and it's combined, of course, with the July 4th holiday and the celebrations around July 4th. Later that morning, Lincoln gets more good news. Ulysses S. Grant telegraphs from Vicksburg that after the 46-day siege at Vicksburg, Vicksburg has surrendered. He's taken Vicksburg as well. And to this day, people in Vicksburg there's a kind of a bipolar sense of July 4th. One aspect of July 4th, of course, in the American Revolutionary heritage is celebrated, but Vicksburg's fall and occupation by the North on July 4th, 1863, is a more somber event. And so you find that July 4th in Vicksburg is not as enthusiastically celebrated, as I say, to this day, in the way it's celebrated in the rest of the United States. So this is very, very good news for Lincoln. And news that Lincoln and his administration very much needed. It's been nothing, as you heard in a previous lecture, it's been nothing but bad news all along since, the Battle of Manassas. Yes, there are some victories for the Union, but they're few and far, and up until Vicksburg and Gettysburg, July 4th, 1863, the Confederates have tenaciously resisted the Anaconda Plan, the encirclement, and it's only on, as I say, on July 4th that the key to the Mississippi River, the complete encirclement of the Confederacy, finally takes place as Vicksburg falls. And so that could be said kind of be the halfway point, because now that Anaconda needs to start constricting around the Confederacy, and that's how the rest of the war now is going to be fought. It's the Union will now start pressing from the north and from the west into the Confederacy, and it's a long, bloody history still to go there. 10 days after the Battle of Gettysburg in New York, the lottery system for calling up men for conscription in the Army begins. Men's names on slips of paper were drawn from a box and their names published, requiring them to report for military service. The problem, of course, is since Lincoln declared the emancipation of slaves in Confederate territory and now makes this war about the liberation of African slaves, African American slaves. They are Americans in the sense that that generation of slaves were mostly natural born Americans. They had not been brought from Africa by them. Their grandmothers might have been, but certainly most slaves in the 1860s were born in the United States. And so from that moment, and actually from the time of Lincoln's election, the Democratic Party has been focused on New York's Irish and German Catholic residents to prepare them for the emancipation of slaves and the resultant labor competition when Southern blacks would supposedly free North. And so to these Irish and German New Yorkers and others, white New Yorkers, the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, is a confirmation of their worst fears. And now Copperhead Press is telling them that you're being drafted, conscripted to go to war to die, while freed slaves for whom you died are going to be coming north and taking their jobs and their widow wives and orphan daughters. That's how it's kind of presented to the New York populace. And white free laborers often in this period compared their value unfavorably to that of Southern slaves, stating that, quote, we are sold for $300, the price of an exemption from war service, whilst they pay thousands for Negroes, end of quote. And so in the midst of wartime economic distress, whites begin to believe that their political leverage and economic status is rapidly declining as African Americans appear to them to be gaining power. So on Saturday, July 11th, 7 days, a week after the Battle of Gettysburg, the first lottery of the conscription law now is held. And for 24 hours, things in the city remain relatively quiet. The second drawing of numbers is scheduled to be held on Monday, July 13th, 1863. They're held, these lotteries, in the provost marshal's office. The provost marshal is a kind of a military police combined with military conscription office, the provost marshal. And so at 10 a.m., this furious crowd of some 500 New Yorkers gather in front of the 9th District Provost Marshal's office at 3rd Avenue and 47th Street. And when the draft, the lottery begins and those slips of paper start being read out, the crowd now begins throwing large paving stones through the window. And certainly, again, as these illustrations serve to underscore just how hostile not just the populace, but often American news media were towards the Emancipation Act, not only in the South, but in the North. And so this crowd now begins throwing paving stones and attacking police and the various buildings around the provost marshal's office as well. The New York State Militia is entirely absent from New York City, as they're still deployed at Pennsylvania at Gettysburg. And so police need to deal with the riots. The police chief, John Kennedy, he's recognized by people in the mob, and they attack the chief of police. Kennedy is beaten into unconsciousness. His face is bruised and cut, an eye injured, lips swollen. His hand is cut with a knife. He's just a mass of bruises and barely managed to be rescued by his fellow police officers. The police, in response, draw their clubs and revolvers, and they charge the crowd, but the crowd overpowers them. And the New York City Police Department, of course, is very lightly armed, unlike the militia. And they're outnumbered by the rioters, who now begin to spread out through the city, looting, burning, attacking. As the rioters begin to head towards the several armories in the city where there are more heavier weapons, the NYPD ends up barricading itself inside the armories and barely manage to protect whatever arsenals there were inside those armories from being seized by the mobs. The riots will last for approximately 3 days and will be the largest civil insurrection in American history until the Rodney King riots in 1992. The rioters are basically free to burn and loot different parts of the city. The mayor's residence on 5th Avenue is set on fire. The 8th and 5th District police stations are attacked on and set on fire. The offices of the Republican Party newspaper, the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley's newspaper is set on fire as well. And of course, the fire department is not a professional fire department. They're all volunteers. They're volunteer fire departments, and mostly consist of, again, New York City's Irish, and so the fire department and firefighters are actually sympathetic to the rioters, especially since some of them have been even drafted for the war. And so the fire department just stands aside as people run rampant through New York City, through Manhattan primarily. Rioters as well now begin perpetrating lynchings of African Americans in throughout the city. They're hung. Some of their corpses are set alight, like torches, and others are beaten, tortured. The Colored Orphans Asylum on Fifth Avenue, which provided shelter for hundreds of African American children, is attacked by a mob. The police are able to rescue the orphans and get them out of there. And this is kind of contentious. I've read both sources. Both types of sources. Some sources allege that a 9-year-old girl from the orphanage was stomped or clubbed to death. Other sources say that there were no fatalities among the orphans there, so it's unclear. But if in fact there was this fatality, it would not be surprising. And overall, somewhere between 80 to 1,000 people will be killed in these days of rioting. Nobody knows for sure. And later that same week, similar riots break out in Buffalo and a few other cities in New York State. The Army finally will be redeployed from Gettysburg back into New York, and that's how these riots are finally put down. So, Lincoln's good news from Gettysburg really only lasts for about a week once these riots begin. Here you can see this cartoon that appears after the riots, and it's kind of pointing out that these riots only occur in New York. The naughty boy Gotham, who would not take the draft. Mammy Lincoln, there now, you bad boy, acting that way when your little sister Penn takes hers like a baby. A reference, of course, to Pennsylvania, where the draft went smoothly. Again, Pennsylvania is, as I say, not only pro-unionist, but very much pro-abolition because of its large Quaker influence there. So Lincoln, within 7 days of victory at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, once again is facing a gloomy situation. That summer of 1863, a major transformation had taken place in the Union Army. Black males now become eligible to join the Army and die in it. Eventually, some 180,000 African Americans would serve in the Army. In Boston, the heart of the abolitionist movement, crowds cheered as the first black regiments marched off to war. African American soldiers, however, were paid less than white soldiers. They were segregated in all black regiments. They were denied an enlistment bounty, unlike white volunteers, nor could they become officers. They were all led by white officers. In June of 1864, however, Congress will grant equal pay to U.S. colored troops, as they were known, and they'll make those payments retroactive. Otherwise, African American soldiers will receive the same rations, same supplies, and they will receive comparable medical care on the battlefield. In the meantime, the Confederate Congress now passes an ordinance, quote, dooming to death or slavery every Negro taken in arms and every white officer who commands Negro troops, end of quote. This threatens to diminish African American enthusiasm for enlistment in the Union Army. And so on Lincoln's instructions, on July 30th, General Halleck issues an order of retaliation. The order, as it reads, states as follows, quote, it is the duty of every government to give protection to its citizens of whatever class, color, or condition, and especially to those who are duly organized as soldiers in the public service. The law of nations and the usages and customs of war as carried on by civilized powers permit no distinction as to color in the treatment of prisoners of war as public enemies. To sell or enslave any captured person on account of his color and for no offense against the laws of war is a relapse into barbarism and a crime against the civilization of the age. The government of the United States will give the same protection to all its soldiers, and if the enemy shall sell or enslave anyone because of his color, the offense shall be punished by retaliation upon the enemy's prisoners in our possession. It is therefore ordered that for every soldier of the United States killed in violation of the laws of war, a rebel soldier shall be executed. And for everyone enslaved by the enemy or sold into slavery, a rebel soldier shall be placed at hard labor on the public works and continued at such labor until the other shall be released and receive the treatment due to a prisoner of war. End of quote. And that too is a comment on the question that we covered in our seminar as to whether the American Civil War was a total war or not. Again, this kind of escalation, similar to Sherman's orders on using Confederate prisoners of war to clear mines, this seems to be, again, a similar escalation of the kind of brutality of this war. Whether one can interpret this as a kind of recognition of the legal limits and their transgression, or is this the legal limits of war and its transgression and their transgression, or is this in fact an escalation of what we will today certainly think of total war, the execution of hostages, the murder of POWs, and so forth. So it's for you as historians to figure this out for yourselves, to decide with evidence which, with persuasive evidence, which side of that interpretation, these kinds of escalating orders and actions, what do they represent? A recognition of a limitation of conduct in the war, or is this an escalation of the savagery and totality, expanding totality of the war? Gettysburg, success at Gettysburg or not, the war is still bogged down for the Union. Although with the surrender of Vicksburg, the Mississippi now is open to the Union, and the Confederacy is surrounded, there's still a number of obstacles for the Union to now start constricting around the Confederacy. And Atlanta in Georgia kind of represents very much the lower South industrial might of the Confederacy, because certainly the border states are all under siege and there's battles going in them, but Georgia so far has not really suffered any kind of Union incursion at this point. Everything begins to now focus on Chattanooga, the gateway into Georgia, a major railway junction as well, and as well, it's a key, as you can see from the brown color, it's a key to getting through these hills and mountains, particularly the Smoky Mountains is there, and so it's that pass where Chattanooga is located is of tremendous strategic importance for the Union to take. There you can see Chattanooga better here, and the kind of railway junction and the kind of plain you have here, and these mountain passes into Chattanooga and then out of Chattanooga towards Atlanta. And so the Union is pressing at Chattanooga. And throughout the summer of 1863, General Rosecrans, who you might remember from the Battle of Rich Mountain, is attempting to drive southeast at the Confederates in Tennessee. And there'll be a number of battles that will kind of collectively become known as the Battle of Chickamauga or Chattanooga. They're kind of alternatively named. Chattanooga is evacuated as Rosecrans attempts to outflank the Confederates in his attempt to seize Chattanooga. But then he finds his forces trapped in the mountainous territory of the Tennessee-Georgia border. There, on September 18th to 20, 1863, Rosecrans is badly mauled in a series of battles known as the Battle of Chickamauga or the Chickamauga Campaign. By September 21st, after suffering some 16,000 casualties, Rosecrans now withdraws into Chattanooga and finds himself trapped in Chattanooga. The Confederate army surrounds him and now lays siege to Chattanooga. Before being cut off, Rosecrans telegraphed, quote, "We have met with a serious disaster. The enemy has overwhelmed us, drove our right, pierced our center, and scattered our troops there." The looming disaster at Chattanooga now threatens to wipe away all the military and political advantages gained back in July at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Lincoln is in despair. He's just not getting a break. It's going to be Lincoln's secretary, Edwin Stanton, who's Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who's going to save the day. He calls an emergency meeting that night with Lincoln and General Halleck. He proposes to take troops from the Army of the Potomac and railway them down to Chattanooga to save Rosecrans. This is approximately the distance that they're planning, that Stanton proposes to move those troops. Halleck sneers, and even Lincoln, who is kind of very open to radical idea, even Lincoln thinks it's futile. Halleck tells them that it would take 40 days to move the troops that far. Stanton barks back at Halleck. He says, quote, 40 days indeed, when the life of the nation is at stake, end of quote. Stanton insists that he can do it in 7 days if he's given the trains and locomotives. And so, reluctantly, Lincoln gives him a go-ahead. Stanton will now sleep in his office essentially over the next 7 days and organizes a transport from the Army of the Potomac of 25,000 troops, 1,100 horses, 9 artillery batteries, and hundreds of wagons, tents, munitions, and supplies. He personally supervises this transport, not going home for some 7 days until he accomplishes this miraculous movement. And he does it. It's successful. They actually rescue the Union Army at Chattanooga and turn what would have been a disastrous defeat into a victory. Just how miraculous this accomplishment in 1863 is dramatically highlighted for us if we look at how many days it took in the 21st century in a country at peace with available air transport and wireless communications to move and deploy relief into New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. You remember that the U.S. military couldn't even get a bottle of water into New Orleans over a period of 3 days, and get in there over a period of a week. Stanton, in the age of steam, in the 19th century, 2 centuries back, manages to pull this movement and transport off in 7 days without amphibious vehicles, without helicopters, without air transport, and so forth. So it just sometimes goes to show that societies perhaps less developed scientifically or technologically in the past were yet able to overcome challenges in the way that we in the 20th century, the 21st century, have failed to do, despite the kind of advances and advantages we have in our technology. People were better in the past, of better material, better, of a stronger spine and resilience than people generally are today. Sort of a sad statement on kind of the progress of humanity. We're not getting any more efficient or better. We are, I guess, in some areas, but in others, we are just falling behind our ancestors. In the meantime, as all this is happening, Salmon P. Chase now adds more fire in the rear. The presidential election is now a year away, an election in the middle of the Civil War, and nobody expected Lincoln to win or even be nominated to run again. While Lincoln attempts to keep radical and conservative Republicans united in the war against the Confederacy in September, Chase is plotting, encouraging, and exploiting divisions between the two factions in the Republican Party, between the radicals and the conservatives. In late September, the Missouri Republican Party is in a crisis. Since the Emancipation Proclamation did not extend to slaves in border states allied with the Union, these states were left to determine the fate of slavery independently. Popular sovereignty, the doctrine of popular sovereignty. In Missouri, conservative Republicans are advocating gradual emancipation, while radical Republicans are calling for total and immediate emancipation. And so you have this kind of conflict within Lincoln's Republican Party in Missouri. The radicals now accuse Lincoln's military commander in Missouri, General John Schofield, of picking sides and abusing his authority by arresting leading radical Republicans and suppressing radical Republican newspapers under the guise of military necessity. And so now a delegation of radical Republicans from Missouri come to Washington to demand that Lincoln remove Schofield and endorse the radical Republican faction in Missouri. That evening, before this meeting that Lincoln is going to have with them, he consults with his advisors. He knows that the radicals are going to carry the state in the next election. He doesn't want to alienate them. In the meantime, Chase invites the radical committee to visit him first, and begins to position himself. Certainly he has the pedigree for it, being the founder of the former Free Soil Party, as the leader of the radical faction in the Republicans, and as well as a radical Republican candidate for the upcoming presidential elections. So, in the end, Lincoln will tell this delegation when he meets them the next day, which, by the way, the delegation turned down the invitation from Salmon P. Chase. But Lincoln, of course, very quickly, and his allies learned that this invitation was issued. And so Lincoln very wisely tells the radical delegation that if indeed he discovers that Schofield is favoring one side over another in his administration of Missouri, he will fire him. And so the delegation returns home somewhat empty-handed, but persuaded. And once Lincoln assesses Schofield's orders and policies in Missouri, Lincoln decides that indeed Schofield is favoring the conservative Republican faction, is not impartial, and he fires him just as he promised. This again, gives Lincoln this kind of reputation, honest Abe, for honesty. And once he says something, you can count on it that he will be true to his word, and that becomes very much Lincoln's reputation. So that again dampens Chase's campaign to position himself as the next candidate, but Chase and his allies continue targeting Lincoln's cabinet and continue these quote fire in the rear type of conspiracies against Lincoln's government. November 19th, 1863, Lincoln now travels to Gettysburg to dedicate monuments to the war dead there. And he makes what is probably his most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, perhaps the most famous speech in American history. The speech is remarkably short. It's only 10 sentences long and lasts only 2 minutes. Only one photograph exists of Lincoln delivering that speech, and the reason being was that the speaker before Lincoln spoke for about 2 hours, and so a lot of the photographers had put their cameras down and stood down to wait for that speech to end. When Lincoln begins his speech, none of them kind of really rush to take pictures because they assume that Lincoln will therefore speak himself for another 2 hours, and are shocked that the speech is only 10 sentences long and 2 minutes long. So only one photographer manages to take this image of Lincoln delivering the Gettysburg Address. There are some allegations that Lincoln kind of made up the speech in the carriage on the way to the battlefield or in the train on the way to Gettysburg. That's not true. There are notes he had thought through the speech carefully. It's certainly unique that this speech is so short, but Lincoln, of course, is a unique politician and a unique president. And the speech, of course, begins with these famous lines that almost all American school children are familiar with, quote, "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." And it concludes with this paragraph, quote, "We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government by and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. End of quote. It's short and sweet, the Gettysburg Address. It's deeply rooted in the American political psyche and quoted or referred to piecemeal, endlessly. The speech inspired certainly Martin Luther King Jr., who almost exactly 100 years later, in August of 1963, delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech, standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. And one of the most recognized modern speeches in American history. And Martin Luther King alludes also to kind of Lincoln's textual structure when Martin Luther King says, quote, 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon of light, of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. End of quote. The passage, government of the people, by the people, for the people, is also one that is deeply rooted in American political discourse, even in its municipal architecture, courtrooms, government buildings, sometimes in their granite or concrete foundations, have that slogan carved into the wall or the entryway into again, a courtroom or a legislature. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's a representative model of a republic where the people have sovereignty and the people govern, not the politicians. And one that we're hearing right now as I record this lecture in the period following the 2020 elections in the United States, as there is an attempt by the current sitting president, Donald Trump, to overthrow the clear majority vote of American people and to seize their sovereignty, which is essentially, if Trump is successful, that is what he's doing. He's actually attacking the Republican Democratic Foundation, Democratic with a small d, not Democratic Party, the Republican Democratic Foundation of the United States. 2 days later, November 21st, by now Rosecrans has been relieved of command, and General Ulysses S. Grant takes over personally. So 2 days later, November 21st, you get the Third Battle of Chattanooga, or the Battle of Chattanooga. It is, again, a series of major battles, which include the Battle of Lookout Mountain and the Battle of Missionary Ridge. But on November 25th, the Confederates were now thrown back from Chattanooga, and the way into the Deep South towards Atlanta, Georgia, is now opened up. Again, this is good news, desperately needed by Lincoln as 1863 is coming to an end. But it's going to take nearly a year, maybe 10 months to get to Atlanta yet. There's much of the war to still go on. And the Civil War itself still has another 16 months to go at this point. Robert E. Lee's army of Northern Virginia has regrouped around Richmond and Petersburg now. They're entering the fourth year of the war. Richmond remains a mere 100 miles from Washington, but it remains unconquered, the capital of the Confederacy, mocking the Union, just 100 miles away. And despite the fact that Chattanooga has fallen, New Orleans has fallen, all these distant cities have, Vicksburg and Nashville have all fallen, but 100 miles away, Richmond remains still holding out against the Union. And so Lincoln now, after assessing Ulysses S. Grant's performance over the last 18 months, is convinced that he has finally found a general that he was seeking to lead the Army of the Potomac to victory at Richmond. And so, as it often happens, or sometimes happens in history, and in the history of warfare, this is going to become a sort of final duel between two giants, two great generals, who up until now had not exactly faced each other directly. General Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. Lincoln now calls General Ulysses S. Grant to Washington. He gives him the command of the Army of Potomac, and shortly after that, he will as well appoint Ulysses S. Grant General-in-Chief of the entire United States Army and the war effort against the Confederacy. And now, the killing up until now will seem like minor skirmishing in view of what will be coming next.